Chapter 7 The Archaic Avant-Garde. The last great assembly of the fairies took place in 1839. In an unseemly sectarian brawl, the little people debated whether their existence was any longer necessary, and a defeatist wing of them glumly abandoned the country the day after the convention. Ireland was growing gradually disenchanted, as its semi-paganized Christianity yielded ground to a more orthodox Catholicism. Religion in pre-famine Ireland had blasphemously mingled the sacred and the profane, and the Catholic Church did battle with this hybridized creed by frowning on patens and stations, wakes, holy wells, and crossroads dancing. At its most extravagant, this popular culture could erupt into carnivalesque riot. Nudity, cross-dressing, indecent phallic games, mock marriages, sexual horseplay, grotesque parodies of Christ's Passion, all of it documented in 1853 by the appropriately named antiquarian J.G.A. Prim. But the days when the corpse at a wake might be dealt a hand of cards, have a pipe stuck in his mouth, or even be dragged around the dance floor were numbered. From the mid-century onwards, the ultramontane authority of the redoubtable Paul Cullen was everywhere to be felt, as the Archbishop, later to become Ireland's first cardinal, chastised a lax clergy, centralized religious celebrations in a spate of newly built churches, and struggled to purge his flock of their heathen practices. The Irish Catholic Church of the 19th century was in fact a thoroughly modern phenomenon, not at all the traditional formation it is often mistaken for, but like many a modern phenomenon, it back-projected a venerable pedigree for itself. Cullen's streamlining of the spirit was matched by a modernizing of the economy. In the wake of famine, death, and emigration, a society of courtiers and landless labourers yielded to one dominated by strong and middle farmers, and the population fell as the Irish converted from being one of the earliest marrying to the latest and most rarely marrying people in Europe. The country was in the process of shifting from a traditional tillage economy to modern large-scale pastoral production, and was gradually reaping the gains of this agrarian revolution. By 1850, Ireland had one of the most commercially advanced agricultures in the world, and was fast developing one of the world's densest railway systems. It also contained the fifth greatest industrial city on earth. The consumer market expanded as imports increased fivefold between 1850 and 1914. The literacy rate was impressively high. The number of national schools, along with the number of newspapers, doubled from 1850 to 1900. Almost all of the Irish now spoke English, and a professional Catholic middle class had begun to burgeon. O'Connell's political machine prefigured in almost every respect the modern political party, of which he could justly be said to be the pioneer. Later in the century, the Irish Parliamentary Party, the first modern political party at Westminster, could compare favourably in effective organisation with most of its continental counterparts, and outmatch them all for the swiftness with which it had made the transition from loose local groups to tightly centralised movement. Presiding over these developments was an unusually modernised state, the fruit of colonial intervention. A largely pre-industrial society displayed all the political forms of a more developed social order. Unlike the parliamentary party, however, the country as a whole had not leapt at a bound from tradition to modernity. Instead, it presented an exemplary case of what Marxism has dubbed combined and uneven development. Cormac O'Grada remarks how, in 19th century Ireland, the decline in the south coincided with an industrial revolution quite as dramatic and thoroughgoing as anything happening in Preston or Middlesbrough. The structure of the pre-famine banking economy, he adds, bespoke both commercialization at one level and mass poverty at another. Ireland's rate of income growth remained the slowest in Western Europe, and what affluence there was drastically ill-distributed. The strong farmers had done well, but the lot of the humbler smallholders was arguably as wretched as before, and those of the rural proletariat, who had survived the near extinction of their class in the famine, were probably as poorly off as ever. Much of the rural economy remained archaic far into the present century. In 1917, there were a mere 70 tractors in the whole of the country. There were marked regional variations, with much of the West still locked in a pre-famine form of economy. The country as a whole was growing gradually more well-heeled, but it had started a good deal further back than many a European nation. with drastically low standards of living in the 17th century, so that even a dramatic increase in production could fail to raise those standards much above subsistence level. Having extricated itself from the calamity of the Great Hunger, an event into which it had drifted despite an agricultural revolution and a sustained growth in foreign trade, Ireland was now heading straight for the most ferocious class struggles it had ever witnessed in the land wars of the late 1870s. Tradition and modernity were intimately interwoven, just as a commercial and a subsistence economy, one cash-based and the other largely a stranger to money, had long existed cheek by jowl in the Irish countryside. If rural Ireland was a land of immemorial custom, it was also one of the earliest examples in Europe of a modern agrarian economy with a classical capitalist rent system implanted by its 17th century invaders. In the Victorian epoch, the old and the new continued to form strange conjunctures. Perhaps no country with so high a rate of literacy had so low a per capita income in the second half of the 19th century. Belfast, the country's most economically advanced centre, was ideologically speaking one of its most atavistic, awash with ferocious sectarian strife. The most industrially progressive region of the island, Ulster, also had been the last redoubt of traditional Gaelic civilization. The stringent traditionalist morality of the post-famine epoch, sexual repression, deferred gratification, enforced celibacy, clerical regulation, was partly in the name of a modernizing drive to ensure impartable inheritance and preserve the farm intact. An archaic moral superstructure thus served an increasingly modern base. Conversely, the fact that the state in Ireland was of a modernizing kind, with its centralized structures of education, public health, law, and order, was partly a function of the country's traditional backwardness, as the burden of public administration in a conflict-ridden colony shifted from an incompetent or indifferent landlordism to central government itself. As far as education went, Ireland gained a modern school system before Britain, but the content of that education, classics, mathematics, literature, but no science, commerce, or modern languages, was of a timorously traditionalist kind. A different kind of mixture of tradition and modernity had appeared in the schooling system of the 18th century, where the very teachers who transmitted to their pupils a Gaelic tradition of political rebellion were also at the centre of a revolution in English language literacy. And nothing could symbolize a more bizarre conjuncture of ancient and modern than 1916, when it was as though the slain and resurrected fertility gods of Jessie, Weston, and James Frazer had taken to the streets of Dublin armed with rifles, some of them almost as antique as the deities in question. Indeed, it is possible to see the Rising as a watershed between two strains of nationalism, between the romantic, idealist, traditionalist version of the creed which carried out the insurrection, much of it with Anglo-Irish roots, and the modernizing, Catholic, petit bourgeois variety which reaped the fruits of it. The post-famine Irish economy was on an uphill trek, aided by the permanent hemorrhage of emigration, but the pre-famine period had witnessed the deindustrialization of much of the society beyond north-eastern Ulster, and the country proved slow to recover. The Irish peasantry were cusped between backwardness and material progress, poorly housed and clothed, but, apart from the semi-starvation months between harvests each year, tolerably well fed and in impressive physical shape. Irishmen were on average taller than Englishmen, as we know from the statistics of the British Army, 1/3 or more of which was supplied by Irish recruits in the 19th century. As a consequence of the land wars, a still impoverished class of labourers and small tenantry combined their material backwardness with a remarkably up-to-date political consciousness. Daniel O'Connell had accomplished the extraordinary feat of harnessing the traditional sentiments of the Irish masses to his secular, liberal, utilitarian programme, and Parnell had repeated the experiment with striking success. The supporting masses, R.V. Comerford comments on the O'Connellite campaigns, were entering a modernizing world of ordered, pragmatic politics, while at the same time expressing themselves in terms of an Irish version of the millennialism characteristic of the old European peasantry. The repeal movement was in one sense a nostalgic affair, with its totemic appeal to Grattan's Parliament, yet to recreate that Parliament in post-emancipation conditions would have proved disruptively radical. As Patrick O'Farrell writes, Irish archaism was so profound, so much at variance with English ideas of what should be, that it exhibited a most revolutionary complexion, especially in view of its violent expression. What the Irish saw as reform, O'Farrell adds, the British viewed as revolutionary. What the British defined as reform, the Irish received as a threat to their traditional way of life. In Britain, the industrial middle class had been deeply stamped, ideologically speaking, by a traditionalist landowning order, but that landowning class was itself the oldest capitalist formation in Europe, modern in its economic rationality, whatever its neo-feudalist spirit, and its middle-class underlings, the spearhead of the world industrial order, were to prove a powerfully progressive force within British society as a whole. Ireland, by contrast, was saddled with a peculiarly archaic, unreconstructed style of landlordism. It was, every bit as much as its British counterpart, a capitalist formation, and the Anglo-Irish were accustomed to seeing themselves as the sole modernizing force in a nation of benighted peasants. But it was a woefully inert brand of rural capitalism, an old-fashioned form of modernity which lacked the challenge of an industrial middle class to spur it into life. What class of that kind existed was largely confined to northeast Ulster. So it came about that the mantle of revolutionary modernism in Ireland passed to the rural middle class. Passed, in a word, to one of the most conservative formations in Western Europe. It was left to this parochial presence to accomplish the modernizing process in Ireland by sweeping away a retrograde landlordism and installing a reactionary ruralism in its place. One internally contradictory class, a gentry with a capitalist base and a traditionalist ideology, gave way to another of much the same ilk, and a similar mixture of the modern and the traditional applied to Anglo-Irish relations. British rule in Ireland had been a force for both progress and paralysis. If it modernized the country, it had also, in Patrick O'Farrell's words, arrested the internal development of Irish self-awareness, preserving it in a pre-modern condition. At just the point when the idea of national autonomy was seizing Enlightenment Europe, Ireland meekly surrendered what meagre independence it possessed in the Act of Union. There was no question, then, of an eyeball-to-eyeball encounter between tradition and modernity. Irish society was stratified in this respect, made up of disparate timescales. Its history was differentiated rather than homogeneous, as the Anglicized and the atavistic existed side by side, and a commercialized agriculture still bore a few quasi-feudal traces. Modernity and peasant society are not, in any case, necessarily at odds. As Samuel Clarke and James Donnelly point out, modern capitalism actually increased the size of the European peasantry. The 1830s and 40s in Ireland witnessed an accelerating decline of traditional popular culture as a modern democracy began to take shape. Yet Gaelic culture was already from the 18th century a contradictory affair, as a politically self-conscious Catholic middle class itself took a hand in burying a traditional Gaelic order with its modernizing projects. Ireland, according to L.M. Cullen, was the last Western European country to abandon the medieval world, with a landed class which still occupied thatched houses as late as the early 18th century. But it was also, so Cullen considers, a society remarkably ready to jettison its traditions, exceptionally open to and receptive of change, more insouciant about preserving its native language, for example, than any other Celtic people. The Irish are supposed to fetishize the past, but in quite what sense this constitutes a backward-looking mentality is debatable. As with Walter Benjamin's anti-historicist spirit, it would seem less a question of grasping the past as the prehistory of the present than of constellating an image plucked from that past with a quick sense of the contemporary. The Irish people, grumbled John O'Leary, have a most vivid recollection of Brian Boru, but they frequently forget all about the day before yesterday. And Tom Garvin reminds us of how Irish nationalism's view of the recent past, in contrast to an idealized golden age, was often enough implacably negative. What is recent is not last week, but antiquity. For James Joyce, the fact that it was an Irish ruler who had invited the English into the country in the first place, with the connivance of the Pope, was an excellent reason for not being a nationalist. But this backward glance to the 12th century is precisely a nationalist habit of mind. Anti-historicist consciousness blends the archaic with the absolutely contemporary, squeezing out the dreary continuum between them. And this, as we shall see, is as true of Ireland's modernism as it is of its nationalism. It is a time warping, obvious enough in the idealizing of the West, the home of an echt Irishness which, as Kevin Whelan indicates, was permanently settled in some of its largest sectors only in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Luke Gibbons points out that much of what is now taken to be traditional Irish values is of fairly recent vintage. It is worth adding, too, that the timeless Aran Islands of a J.M. Synge had a fishing industry directly linked by large trawlers to the London markets. But the time warping runs deeper. For what is afoot in 19th century Ireland, with the cataclysm of the famine, the agrarian revolution, the sharp decline of the language, and the sea changes in popular culture, is the transformation within living memory of a social order, in some ways still quite traditional, and so a peculiarly shocking collision of the customary and the contemporary. The time of artistic modernism is a curiously suspended medium, a surreally foreshortened temporality in which the laws of orderly narrative are lifted, so that time, much as in the dream or the unconscious mind, seems at once fantastically speeded up and fixated upon certain images dredged from the depths of some ancient collective memory. This, for a Walter Benjamin, is also the rhythm of political revolution, which blasts a space pregnant with possibility in the continuum of conventional history. And it is perhaps not too fanciful to detect this modernist consciousness, at once traumatized and enraptured by the new, mournfully arrested and dynamically open to the future, in the course of Irish history after the famine, when, in an apocalyptic twist, the primitive and the primeval, the atavistic event of the famine itself, have only just happened, and happened in a way that at once brings you face to face with the paralyzing past and briskly disposes of its debris for the creation of the authentically modern. The present is now a weightless moment, precariously balanced between the ancient and the avant-garde, a condition of absolute loss, which nevertheless brims with unborn potential, a mere empty passageway between a past which, since it is only yesterday, cannot be relinquished, and a wholly transfigured future which is just about to arrive. From the time of the famine, writes Patrick O'Farrell, the strongly developed sense of the past, which was so powerful in Ireland, ceased to exercise a conservative social role and came to be a dynamic prediction of the future. Perhaps an element of this consciousness was the extraordinary rapidity of the post-famine economic recovery, which seems to have been well underway by the early 1850s. And when the land settlements finally arrived at the end of the 19th century, they offered the peasantry in modernizing style what they themselves regarded as their traditional rights. The modernist sensibility we are describing is not, of course, synonymous with modernity. On the contrary, it is in one sense its sworn enemy, hostile to that stately march of secular reason which was precisely, for many a 19th century Irish nationalist, where a soulless Britain had washed up. Anglo-Irish aesthete and Gaelic ascetic could join hands here in a common censure. If modernism is, among other things, a last-ditch resistance to mass commodity culture, Irish nationalism would set its own ancient spirit of aristocracy against the dismally standardized society on its doorstep, and so act out, in its own way, the radical conservatism of so much modernist art. The Irish may have felt crushed by the British, but they tended to feel superior to them as well. If Britain stands for enlightenment, and nationalism is a child of enlightenment too, then one can resolve this embarrassing contradiction by a nationalism which is modernist rather than modern, one which links the venerable and the very new in a common front against empty linear time. In one sense, it is ironic that Britain should have come to represent for Irish nationalists the very nadir of the modern, vulgar, materialist, spiritually polluted, industrially devastated. For if it was all of that, it was also in its own way a thoroughly traditionalist culture. Ireland may have been arrested in its own development by a backward ruling class, but that class was simply a more uncouth, caricatured version of a traditionalist landowning oligarchy over the water. If Ireland was in many ways an archaic country, so was the land of its proprietors, and the two conditions were by no means unrelated. If the histories of the two nations were out of step at one level, they were parallel enough at another. The modernist time of nationalism then solves this problem by moving off in two directions at once. Turning its back on a callow British modernity, it sets off in search of its own ancient spirituality, but in doing so it takes a modernizing leap forward, one which will break beyond the history of the merely recent into an authentic future. Like Walter Benjamin's Angelus Novus, it will move backwards into the future with its eyes fixed sorrowfully upon the past, impelled into that new creation by the winds let loose from a paradise it has lost. Since the recent past of British colonialism is a mere aberration, it forms an empty passage of time through which the past can return in all its plenitude, this time as the future. It is precisely the remote past, uncontaminated by recent time, which can provide the most stirring image of the future. Like modernism, nationalism will outflank the merely modern by turning to advantage the shattered time to which that era has reduced it. Since those who are the sheer waste products of modernity are less enthralled to that epoch, they are able to shift on ahead of the present, exposing the moderns as yesterday's men. If a one-way history has disintegrated around you, then it is just as easy, in this adrift, emancipated condition, to move forwards as well as backwards. Virtue can be plucked from necessity, just as the art of Samuel Beckett, with its starved landscapes, that are at once island and anywhere, shows well enough how to be stripped of your particular culture is to become a citizen of the world. Both nationalism and modernism turn on a play of difference and identity. In asserting its equal right to freedom with other nations, and so its identity with them, nationalism finds itself affirming the uniqueness of its own culture. An identity with others modulates into self-identity. For the more romantic brands of nationalism, all nations have an equal right to autonomy, but each will achieve it in its own inimitable style. The nationalist aspiration is for the people to enter as free and equal partners onto the global stage, yet the intense self-awareness which this brings with it risks driving the nation back upon itself in solitary self-communing. In any case, the equality at stake conceals a disabling difference. The very conditions of backwardness which drive a people to claim equal status with others will also render that equality depressingly unequal once it is achieved. Why is it, inquires Partha Chatterjee, that non-European colonial countries have no historical alternative but to try to approximate the given attributes of modernity, when that very process of approximation means their continued subjection under a world order which only sets their tasks for them and over which they have no control? The nation should not be governed by a foreign power because it has as much right to independence as those who rule it, and so is commensurate with them, but also because it is entirely sui generis, and so incommensurate. In one sense, colonialism is a false differentiation of equals. In another sense, it is the political equivalent of a category mistake, deceptively linking two distinct realities. But to assert your difference from the colonizers is to risk taking on board their own belief in a national essence, and so to end up identical with them. Ironically enough, Ireland made its strike for independence at just the point where it was coming most to resemble the society which held it down. At a time when the most powerful nations have long since thrust their own national bourgeois revolutions into historical oblivion, the striving of small nations to be free is bound to appear quaintly archaic, not least in a multinational world in which the leading powers are beginning to surrender something of their own national sovereignty. But this difference is in fact a question of deferral, a time lag between more and less successful nations, and so conceals an identity between them. Indeed, it is partly because multinational capitalism brings with it a deepening exploitation of its neo-colonial fringes that those nations are driven to seek an independence which can then only seem antediluvian. In the build-up to the nationalist revolution in Ireland, the elegantly sceptical John Eglinton is already speculating that the day of nations is passing away, and this in 1906. The idea of the nation, as Benedict Anderson has argued, is an abstraction, yet the community implied by it is not entirely imaginary. Nations are not self-identical, but the fact remains that colonized peoples, however unevenly, are indeed oppressed precisely as peoples. What gives them their unity is not some racial essence, but the negative fact of being held down as a whole. It is colonialism, not nationalism, which makes of the nation something more than a fictive entity. The fact that some of the colonized reap more benefit from this arrangement than others is no argument against this point. If the idea of a people subdued as a whole was simply a fiction, the rhetoric of nationalism would be a good deal less persuasive than it has proved to be. The idea of woman is an abstraction too, yet the blunt fact remains that women are oppressed precisely as women, whatever their differences of class or color. All human community or solidarity is at some level imaginary, even that around the village green. Ideologically speaking, the abstractness of the concept of the nation can prove a problem. It will take the people, with their inevitably local allegiances, some time to learn it. The conflict between the Republican universalism of the United Irishmen and the more humdrum concerns of many of their followers is a case in point. But few modern political ideas have survived transcoding into those vividly concrete terms with so little loss. Certainly not the idea of proletarian internationalism. If nationalism is a bourgeois abstraction, it is equally a matter of passionate popular sentiment, and much of its appeal springs from the fluency with which a translation can be made from one to the other.